Welcome to another episode of Choral Ed. I'm your host, Micah Bland. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Today, I'm pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Robert Jordan from Adelphi University of New York, who'll be sharing with us about a democratic approach to selecting repertoire. Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here.
To begin, can you give us a brief overview of your approach to the democratic selection of repertoire?
So when I started inviting students in my middle school and high school classes to choose repertoire with me, I asked them to find choral arrangements that appealed to them and then present them to the class for consideration. To help students in their research, I demonstrated how to use music publisher resources, online resources, especially online perusal scores and recordings. It was important, though, to talk with students about how these publisher websites imply a chosen canon of music, and that was primarily Western art music. And discussing whose music was included and excluded prompted our search for publishers that represented composers marginalized by race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, and so on. So after we did that, I suggested pieces on my own as well for students to consider. This was a useful exercise for me because it required that I really think about why I was selecting certain music for the group to sing. I had to ask myself if my suggestions for the group were limited by my extensive training in Western European classical music or limited simply by what was available in our choir library. This music was purchased by me and other teachers before me that came from similar cultural backgrounds as mine, which was a cultural background that did not represent all of the students in my choirs.
That's awesome. And so I'm glad you are exposing students to a wider range of repertoire and getting them to think about that, not just go to J.W. Pepper and that's where we always start usually as teachers.
Yes.
It's a great resource, but there's many other options and opportunities out there. That's wonderful. So for a teacher who's starting out and wanting to implement this approach, what suggestions would you give and how would you suggest they begin the process?
I think it's important to remember that it's okay to start simply and just try one or two things. And at the time that I was trying these democratic strategies out in my classroom, I had about 500 students in 9 choirs from grade 6 to 12. That did not look the same in each one of those classes. I think it's important to point out that the students had to become comfortable with democratic classroom approaches, but so did I, because this was new to me as well. And so I think it's okay for teachers to give themselves the grace to realize that we don't have to have students picking all of the repertoire right away. We can build up to that, or we can decide that that's not quite a good fit for our classroom community, but we want to try to pick some pieces together. For us, the sixth graders chose music from a selection of pieces that I had curated for them. So this approach preserved a great amount of my teacher control, the kind of control we're used to seeing in traditional musical ensembles. Then starting with seventh graders, they really started to take more of the responsibility. They were given more and more freedom to select pieces and to suggest them to the class. I think in middle school, I still needed to suggest a lot of the repertoire that students were choosing from, because depending on the group of students, they simply needed that guidance. Perhaps they were reticent to share their ideas in front of their peers for fear of judgment or bullying, or because they needed to know from my example what was expected in a school choir program in our community. So depending on the group of students, I saw a large increase in students suggesting pieces during their 8th grade year. I felt like that was the year where students were really taking ownership of finding their own music. And that was the last year of our middle school. So once they transitioned to high school, it was common for students to be suggesting and choosing all the music for a concert. But when I think about first steps, I think the first step is deciding how many pieces students will choose on a particular concert. And you need to help students design criteria to help when selecting music. We need to like and dislike, that's great, but we also need to move beyond the immediate sort of response of I don't like that or I like that, but why do we like that? Or why do I like this one a little more than this one? So we started out with 4 criteria that I was familiar with from Julia Shaw's work, particularly in her article, The Skin That We Sing, Culturally Responsive Choral Music Ed, that appeared in the Music Educators Journal. She came up with program criteria and we added to it. And then we also came up with compositional criteria that helped us judge the difficulty of a piece of music and how it might fit with our group's experience level. I have those criteria to share, or we can, I can share those in a different way, or we can talk through them now, whatever you think is
Sure.
best.
Yeah, let's talk through those now. What are those criteria and kind of how do students go about how do you instruct students to look for this music? Is it individually? Is it homework? Is it in
Yeah.
groups?
So first with the criteria, Julia Shaw's criteria in that article I referenced started with how does this music build upon students' prior experiences? How does the music capitalize on students' cultural knowledge? How does it allow students to experience through their preferred learning styles? And how does it showcase students' culturally informed performance styles? Then we thought these were important to our choirs. How does this music contribute something new to the ensemble's performance set? How does the music provide challenge and opportunities for growth? And then how does it align with student selected concert themes if there is a concert theme? Not always was that something that students were inspired by. And then in terms of compositional criteria, I helped them create a list based on what I knew about choral pedagogy, but also just some real nuts and bolts sort of ideas about looking at a piece of music and trying to assess how long it will take to learn this music. So we looked at voicing and instrumentation. Is it accompanied? Is it unaccompanied? What's the range in tessitura? Technical and conceptual complexity, the duration and length. Sometimes if a difficult piece is 2 minutes long, that's a lighter lift than maybe an intermediate piece that's 6 minutes long. Not that there's a lot of 6-minute pieces for K through 12, but there are some. And then lyrics and languages. Sometimes languages were something that really excited students, but sometimes we had to realize that a certain approach to a language may take longer to refine. And we talked about notational systems. Would this music be traditionally taught by rote and not through Western Standard Music Notation? And then always we were thinking about the available instructional time. Some of our concerts had many weeks. Sometimes the turnaround could be as little as 3 in the high school choirs. So that was our criteria. And then when you asked about are they choosing it as individuals or in class, I tried to preserve as much of class time as possible for these discussions and rehearsal. But I asked students to search for the music outside of class. So that was a big ask. Sometimes students simply didn't have the time, or they weren't motivated to do so. But the students who were took time outside of class as individuals. And I don't know if students were working together, but I can only assume that sometimes they did. They probably collaborated on some of their choices. I think it's important to point out that we also had some performance opportunities that required prescribed repertoire, like our state-sanctioned choral festivals, for example. Those organizations had prescribed repertoire lists, but then also prescribed styles, like perhaps you can pick one piece from the list and then one piece that is in a similar style. And we were also required to sight read at the level of our required piece. So we had to have conversations about, okay, what is reasonable to expect this choir to be able to do successfully in terms of sight reading at festival? And that affects our choices with the repertoire as well. So I just shared the lists with them and we had conversations. And instead of them being able to choose from all the music there is, we had to choose from these repertoire lists, which honestly, sometimes putting parameters and boundaries on things helps students move forward. Sometimes when there's an overwhelming amount of choices, we just sit and we don't make progress.
Hmm. Yeah, so several things you mentioned that I really like, and it's important for teachers who want to implement this to hear because I'm sure many are going to be like, I'm not sure about this. I don't know if I have time to teach all my students all this criteria and so forth. Then sometimes it's relinquishing that power as well. They're afraid to do that. But you talked about a sequential approach to sometimes there was a limited list and so forth. Was there a sequential approach to kind of introducing those criteria to the students, or did they pick that up pretty fast early on? Or like, I'm trying to figure out how those conversations start, and does that take a lot of time at the beginning of a sixth grade year to kind of discuss that?
It developed organically. At first, I was inexperienced with democratic classroom strategies. I didn't realize that there was a need for us to have criteria that we developed together. Why not just say what we like about the piece? Well, I learned very quickly that sometimes those conversations went really well, unprompted with criteria. But I realized we needed a framework. We needed to scaffold this approach for students. We had to scaffold it in more complex ways for the less experienced students. For in sixth grade, they weren't developing the criteria with us. We were really taking the criteria that seventh and eighth graders worked on that was very applicable to the sixth grade context as well. Because I'm not sure if they would have been able to do that. The class had 120 sixth graders in it. So even just the idea that I had 120 students, usually that's limiting in a way when we talk about classroom discussion. Seventh grade and eighth grade choirs had about 40 to 50. That was a little bit easier to make room for those conversations. But I always have to remember that sometimes I discount what sixth graders are able to do. So I also need to remember that maybe they were able to do it and I didn't give them that opportunity. I'm not sure. I think that once we figured out, it was probably a full year before we started to say, I think we need some boundaries. I think, or maybe not boundaries, but a way forward, a scaffold to talk about why this music is a good fit or not. So it happened over time. I started with Julia Shaw's work because I simply started researching, okay, what are the ideas out there in the world about democratic practice or culturally responsive teaching? Because the other side of this is if students are choosing their music, it has a greater potential to be culturally responsive. It's not a guarantee, but oftentimes that helps the process. I would say we were doing this for a few years before these criteria locked in. And I tried to invite students into rethinking the criteria each year, but we really never did change it. We thought about it, we discussed it, and students were like, no, I think this is okay. And that's how it developed organically and over time.
Great, yeah. And then you mentioned that you have about, 40-ish in the seventh grade choir. Do they all select just one piece? And then how do those discussions occur? Do you listen to all of them and then discuss all of them? And so, yeah, how does that process work for you in your classroom?
In the seventh grade, they rarely all chose a piece. I would say in the seventh and eighth grade, we probably ended up with 6 to 10 suggested pieces to choose from. Those students were interested in the process, I think, from what they showed me in class, but not always did they show up the next week with repertoire suggestions. That makes sense for their experience level. I think when they leave school, they leave school. And I love that for them. I want them to enjoy being a child, being a young adult. So that was okay. Once we got to high school, though, sometimes there were one suggestion per student, or sometimes two. So in my treble ensemble, we might have 20 to 30 students in the treble ensemble, depending on the year. Most of the time, each one of those people had a suggestion. So knowing that we need to start this process before the previous concert is done, right? So doing a little bit of this every or on several days is better than just choosing one whole day where we don't sing at all. That was something I tried to avoid. But yes, they would suggest their repertoire, give us some of their reasoning. They didn't have to mention every criterion, but they used that as a guide to build their presentation to the class. And then, yeah, we listened to the recording. So one of the things was if you suggest a, an arrangement, it has to be something where we can secure the rights to perform it by purchasing the sheet music. And it has to be something where we can listen to a recording, whether that be from a publisher website or YouTube or what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned, yeah, only a few might. So I take it your approach is it's not an assignment, it's not for a grade, it's not required. It's kind of more of their interest and their wanting to contribute in that sense. So that's a great approach.
Exactly. I didn't want to force them to do it. I thought partially, once you turn something into a homework sort of situation, it robs it of some of the magic. Not that it always does that, but I wanted this to be an invitation to contribute if you wanted to. And everybody could comment on the piece, even if they didn't suggest something. So everyone was included in the conversation if they wanted to be included. But I really wanted to leave it open to see what might happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach because, yeah, think about it also when you do have an assignment, there's going to be plenty of students that just go, yeah, this song, and they have no real care about it. They just pick the first thing to get the check done off, I've finished the assignment. So, yeah, I think that is a great approach to have it open to students and there's the possibilities there. So when after discussing, you have to reach a consensus about which song or which songs are we going to include in our concert. Are those conversations ever difficult in the sense that maybe some people might have their feelings hurt because they really liked their song, or people didn't agree with my song, whatever it may be? Is that a difficult challenge at times to reach a consensus?
It can be. And I think for me, there's two things here. One is how we reach consensus, and then how we move on after we've reached consensus. And this is a tough one for me. And it's the main sticking point for me that I keep returning to when I reflect on my approach to choosing music with students. I think it's interesting now as a music teacher educator, and the predominance of my teaching at the university is teaching future music teachers. When I share some of these democratic approaches with young adults in a pre-service music teacher program, they're sort of surprised that I would give up this kind of control. Sometimes it just doesn't resonate with what they experienced as a high school choral student. So we really have to start first with, okay, how do we approach choral music education in a more autocratic way, in a more teacher-led way, because they're still learning how to be that teacher. And I think that's important for them to practice those skills before we start practicing some of these more open approaches, because I think it does take a bit of teacher experience and understanding whenever you open up anything, when you open up even your questioning, it takes a little bit of experience. One thing that I keep returning to when I talk to the university students about this is that the way we reach consensus is a real problem. I'm going to keep examining this in future research. For example, in the spring, I'm going to be looking at how this democratic approach to choosing music that I honed in a choral context will work in a high school band in our area. Really excited about that. I don't know if this idea of reaching consensus will come up as a focus in that study, but I'm very interested in continuing that conversation. So here's the problem. If we proceed with a ballot system of voting, we might start with a list of 10 pieces to consider, and then students may try to reduce that by half. So we end up with 5, and they could do that by selecting their top 3 choices. position 1, 2, and 3 for each student. Then the next time we can try to maybe get that down to 3 or 2 or 1 or whatever we want for the concert in terms of the music that the students are choosing. So it's a majority rule, and any majority rule voting approach privileges the majority. That's what it's all about. So if we have students representing a diversity of cultural backgrounds and interests, the repertoire preferred by students of a classroom minority will likely be left off the concert program. And that's a big problem. We did not discover a remedy to this. And I've talked to other music educators, Lisa DeLorenzo, who was a professor of music education at Montclair State University and has written extensively on democratic approaches. We talked about it, and she's like, yeah, that's a real problem. She suggested maybe there's a student in the class that serves as an ombudsman and tries to look out for students who may be being silenced by some students who are just a little bit more extroverted maybe, or just have an easier time voicing their opinions. I never tried anything like that. And I think it's really important, if you try to find a student that's comfortable with that, they really have to be comfortable with that role. And I think that's a big ask for a student to be that sort of person. So I guess the final thought for me is I look forward to hearing from others, maybe viewers of this video, about ideas of reaching consensus that allow for marginalized voices to be heard and for their music to be selected as well. Yeah, it's a real sticking point for me.
Yeah, you bring up some great points there about in this approach, many ways, those who are more outspoken or ex excited to share their work or are extroverted and want to talk about things. The introverted people often can be overlooked. So being mindful of that is critical, and as well as those minority groups that may be overlooked in many ways.
Yeah.
So as we conclude here, do you have any other final thoughts to share with teachers who want to include this approach in their classroom?
I think the most important thing is to be okay with starting slowly. Perhaps with only one piece of music chosen by students per concert or even semester. Maybe you have 2 concerts in a semester and you're just going to make space for one student selected work. The teacher can even start by proposing 5 pieces, like I did with 6th graders, and asking them to choose from the pieces that I'm already comfortable with. That's a good approach too. Then maybe a teacher might experience how students' motivation to refine the repertoire that they were a part of choosing really develops in the class in a palpable way. And that motivational difference may encourage teachers to invite students to choose more music the next time. But regardless of how teachers and students go about this work, I think they should give it a try and just see what happens.
Well, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for sharing with us about this democratic approach to selecting repertoire. I hope our teachers are inspired to give up some of that power that they have to collaborate with their students on selecting repertoire together. For our viewers, thanks for watching, and I hope you continue to inspire the future leaders of our world through this wonderful gift we call music. Thanks.